The Lost Years. Chapter 1, A Day Like Any Other. The small town of Hohenfeld was nestled in a peaceful valley, surrounded by gentle hills and dense forests. With its cobblestone streets, half-timbered houses, and small shops along the main street, it seemed to be straight out of a storybook. The residents lived simple yet fulfilling lives. Each day was a replica of the previous one, and it was precisely this predictability that gave people a sense of security and stability. Marie Koenig, a 34-year-old single mother, was one of those residents. Her life was structured and predictable. Every morning, she would wake up her 8-year-old daughter, Lisa, prepare breakfast, and take her to school before heading to work. Marie worked at a charming little bookstore in the market square, which she ran alongside her best friend, Anna. The two women had known each other since childhood and had been through everything together. Lisa was a lively child with curly brown hair and bright blue eyes. She loved to stroll through the small town, especially in the old playground at the edge of the forest, where she spent hours with her friends. For Marie, this daily routine was perfect. In the safety and routine of her days, she found comfort, especially after Lisa's father had left them years ago. But in this seemingly perfect world, a shadow was beginning to loom. Chapter 2, The Inexplicable Disappearance. It was a summer night like any other when Mr. Muller, a 72-year-old retired teacher, vanished. Mr. Muller was a well-known figure in the town. Every evening, at the same time, he would walk through the town park with his faithful dog, Baloo. That night, everything seemed normal. He said goodbye to his neighbor, Mrs. Schroeder, as he usually did, and headed to the park. But as the night grew deeper, only Baloo returned home. Concern spread quickly. Mrs. Schroeder called the police, and the entire town joined in the search for the elderly man. The police combed through the park and its surroundings, but they found no trace of Mr. Muller. There were no signs of violence, no indications of an accident. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The news of his disappearance spread like wildfire through the town. People gathered, speculating about what might have happened. Some thought that perhaps Mr. Muller had fallen into the dense forest or suffered a collapse in some remote spot. But despite all the speculation, the search was unsuccessful. With each passing day, the hope of finding him alive diminished. For Marie and the other residents of Hohenfeld, this event shook their normally tranquil and predictable world. The idea that someone could disappear in their small town filled everyone with a disturbing sense of insecurity. Chapter 3, The Return of the Disappeared. 2 years passed, and the memory of Mr. Muller slowly faded away. The town had grown accustomed to his absence, and life continued, albeit with a touch of melancholy. Marie continued her simple life, taking care of Lisa and managing the bookstore. But on a rainy autumn morning, when the leaves were falling from the trees and the streets were damp and muddy, something happened that shook the town once more. Mr. Muller returned. It was as if he had never left. The old man suddenly appeared in the park, in the exact spot where he had disappeared 2 years earlier. His clothes were worn, his beard long and unkempt, but his eyes were clear, though slightly disoriented. He couldn't remember that 2 years had passed. To him, it seemed like he had merely closed and opened his eyes in an instant. In his mind, only a second had passed. The news of his return spread through the town like lightning. The residents flocked to the park to see the man who had reappeared out of nowhere. The police and doctors were baffled. There was no explanation for what had happened. Mr. Muller had no memory of anything that could explain the 2-year gap. It was as if time had stood still for him. Marie felt deeply unsettled. These events did not correspond to the logical and safe world she knew. She began to worry about what this could mean for the future, not just for the town but also for herself and Lisa. Chapter 4, The Second Wave. Only a few months after Mr. Muller's return, a new series of inexplicable events began. It seemed as though the town was being haunted by an invisible force. First, a young woman disappeared on her way to work. Her car was found by the side of the road, the engine still running, but she had vanished without a trace. Then it was a student who did not return home after school. Again, there were no clues, no signs, only the emptiness left behind. The town was in a state of shock. Fear and panic spread as no one knew who would be next to disappear. The police intensified their patrols, and the citizens organized nightly vigils, but it seemed they could do nothing against the mysterious force that was making people disappear. For Marie, fear became omnipresent. She wouldn't let Lisa leave the house alone and made sure to accompany her everywhere. The bookstore also became a refuge, where people gathered seeking comfort and answers, though there were none. The town was enveloped in an atmosphere of paranoia, and the sense of security that had once been so natural had now become an ever-present unease. And then, suddenly, the missing people began to reappear. Chapter 5: The Return of the Lost. Exactly 2 years after their disappearance, the people who had vanished started to reappear. It happened in the same inexplicable way as with Mr. Miller. The missing persons would suddenly reappear in the places where they had vanished. To them, no time had passed. Their clothes were the same, their thoughts and memories untouched by the 2 years that had passed for the town. But just like Mr. Miller, there was one nearly imperceptible change. All those who had returned bore a small circular scar at the base of their skulls. The scar was fresh, as if it had appeared just before their return. No doctor in town could explain what had caused these scars, and the returnees had no recollection of any injury. The town was torn between relief and fear. The return of the missing brought joy, but it was tinged with uncertainty and the unexplained mystery of the scars. More and more people began to believe that it might be something supernatural, something beyond human comprehension. Marie watched all of this with growing unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that those who had returned were no longer the same. It was as if something deep within them had changed, something that even they couldn't perceive. Marie began avoiding the returnees, even though she knew it was irrational. But the uncertainty was too great. Chapter 6: The Latent Threat. As the months passed, those who had returned tried to reintegrate into their daily lives. But it was evident that they were struggling. They complained of strange dreams in which they found themselves in white, infinite spaces with no beginning or end. Some spoke of a sense of emptiness, as if they had lost something they couldn't name. In the same town, the feeling that something worse was to come continued to grow. People became more suspicious, not only of the returnees, but also of each other. Rumors spread that the returnees might have been altered, that they might no longer be entirely human. Paranoia was spreading, and the old community spirit that once characterized the town was beginning to crumble. Marie felt increasingly isolated. Even Anna, her best friend, seemed to be distancing herself since a relative of hers had disappeared and then returned. Marie could see the unease in Anna's eyes when she talked about her relative and knew that Anna also didn't believe that the returnees were the same people they once knew. Lisa, who observed all of this with the innocence of a child, seemed the least affected. But Marie couldn't help but worry about her daughter. What if Lisa disappeared one day? That thought kept her awake at night as she listened, waiting for any sound, any whisper, any premonition of what was to come. Chapter 7: The Revelation. Eventually, the local authorities and police requested help from experts from outside. Scientists and researchers from the capital city arrived in Hohenfeld to study the phenomenon. They conducted a series of tests and examinations on the returnees but were unable to find a scientific explanation for what had happened. The scars, they discovered, were surgically precise but showed no signs of having been made by known methods on Earth. Some of the scientists began to speculate that it might be some sort of temporal phenomenon, a disturbance in spacetime that had dragged people into another dimension or a parallel universe. But these theories were mere conjectures and offered no concrete answers. Then, the researchers discovered another unsettling fact: the returnees began to exhibit strange and inexplicable behavior. Some of them unconsciously started drawing complex geometric patterns on the ground, especially near the places where they had disappeared. The patterns resembled ancient, almost forgotten symbols that were not recorded in any known culture. The scientists couldn't make sense of them, but the fear in the town continued to grow. Marie could no longer ignore her fear. One night, while Lisa slept, she looked out the window and noticed that the patterns were also appearing in the park where Lisa used to play. A chill ran down her spine. What did these signs mean? And why was her daughter so fascinated by them? Chapter 8: The Escape Plan. Marie decided that she and Lisa had to leave Hohenfeld. She could no longer live in a town where the inexplicable had become the new normal. She knew she would lose her friend Anna, that she would leave everything she knew behind, but she was determined to protect her daughter. Marie meticulously planned their escape. She packed only the essentials and chose a route that would take them to a nearby city where she hoped to build a new life. But deep down, she knew that there might not be a place where they could truly be safe. Still, she was determined to try, for Lisa's sake and for her own sanity. The night before their planned departure, Lisa disappeared. Marie was beside herself with worry. She ran through the streets, shouting her name, searched the park, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. It was as if her worst nightmare had come true. In her desperation, she went to Anna, who hugged her with tears in her eyes. "We'll find her, Marie. I promise you," Anna whispered, but her words sounded hollow. Chapter 9: The Return. 2 years later. The pain Marie had suffered from losing her daughter was indescribable. She had withdrawn, left the bookstore, and barely spoke to anyone. The town had continued to change, the patterns had become ubiquitous, and the returnees were behaving more and more strangely. And then, one day, the impossible happened: Lisa returned. She appeared exactly where she had disappeared, in the old playground. For Marie, it was a miracle, but at the same time, there was an indescribable fear. Lisa looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared, but something was different. Like the others who had returned, Lisa had a small scar at the base of her skull. Marie tried to hide her feelings as she embraced her daughter. But deep down, she knew that this was no longer the child she had lost. Lisa spoke and moved as before, but there was something cold, something strange in her eyes. Marie had to admit that the time during which Lisa had been missing had changed her forever. She had not only lost time, but also a part of her humanity. Chapter 10: The New Reality. Hohenfeld was no longer the town it had been. The returnees lived among the inhabitants, but they were different, and that difference affected the entire community. The town was wrapped in a strange silence, as if the people were collectively holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Marie and Lisa tried to resume their daily lives, but the distance between them was palpable. Lisa rarely spoke of the 2 years she had lost, and Marie dared not ask her. She knew she feared the answer, that she could not bear to know the truth. One night, while Marie lay awake in bed, she heard noises coming from Lisa's room. Cautiously, she got up and went to the door. Through the crack, she saw Lisa sitting at her desk, drawing something in a notebook. As Marie got closer, she recognized the geometric patterns that Lisa was drawing with a precision and knowledge that no child her age should have. Marie slowly backed away. She knew she had seen something unimaginable, something she could not understand, and that filled her with terror. But she was determined to protect her daughter, no matter what. In the following weeks, strange illnesses began to spread through the town, and people became even more distrustful. The old structures and communities crumbled. But Marie stayed because she couldn't bear to lose Lisa again. Epilogue: The End of Normalcy. Time passed, and Hohenfeld became increasingly forgotten by the rest of the world. The stories about the people who disappeared and then returned slowly spread, but the world seemed unready to accept the incomprehensible. To outsiders, Hohenfeld remained a mystery, an isolated place full of secrets. For Marie and Lisa, the old normalcy was lost forever. They lived in a new reality, marked by uncertainty and fear. But amid this darkness, there were moments of light when Marie looked at her daughter and felt that a part of the old Lisa was still there, a small spark of innocence and joy. But the question of what had really happened during those 2 lost years remained unanswered. And so, Marie continued her life, always hoping to one day understand what had really happened, and with the constant fear that the unknown, which had changed her daughter, might one day return. The end.